this. Okay, now it's going. Yeah, something sure is happening here, and what it is ain't exactly clear. But Retake Our Democracy, with this show and with its blog, try to shed light on what's happening and what you can do about it. Good morning. You are listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Last week, Retake interviewed Philip Shepard. Philip is a recognized and international expert in embodiment. His unique technique has been developed to transform our disconnected experience of self and the world, and are based on the vision articulated and celebrated in books like New Self, New World, and Radical Wholeness. And he's also developed the embodiment present process that is not exactly meditative, but it's a process through which you reconnect with your body and not divorce yourself from your mind, but Philip's perspective is that we spend way too much time trying to think our way out of things and to manage and manipulate other people, the planet, and that this is the source of a good deal of our problems in this society today. And the interview with him it was the longest interview we've ever done. It went for 90 minutes. And you can get that interview at retakeourdemocracy.org and just scroll over the actions page and actions menu in the menu bar, and you'll see below that Retake Conversations, and that's where you'll be able to find that conversation and today's conversation, which is going to be with Cylvia Hayes and Cylvia Hayes. And we'll talk with Cylvia in just a moment, but I've got to fill you in on a few things coming up. One of the things that Retake has done in the last month or two, because of the COVID and because we can't meet together anymore, is to develop a whole Zoominar series. And our last Zoominar series was last Tuesday, and it was with the Land Commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richard, and her general counsel, Ari Birnoff. And that Zoominar can be watched again at, again, go to retakeourdemocracy.org and go over the actions and event menu and hover there, and you'll see Zoominar series, and the recordings of previous Zoominars is there. But on May 19th, we're going to have a very important conversation with gas and oil, about the gas and oil crisis in New Mexico, with Heather Ferguson from Common Cause, and with Dee Dee Feldman, a former state senator who wrote a book about the state senate in New Mexico, and also Kathleen Sabo, New Mexico Ethics Watch. And the Ethics Watch and Common Cause New Mexico developed a really illuminating, it's about 80 pages, examination of the degree to which the gas and oil industry dominates the state legislature here in New Mexico. And because of it, we get virtually nothing done towards advancing to a just transition, keeping the gas and oil in the ground, or even just regulating the gas and oil industry. COVID is sort of taking care of that and regulating it as the gas and oil prices have plummeted. On May 5th, which is just coming up next week, we're going to have internationally known author, the author of The End of Ice, Dar Jamail, on the radio show. And Dar has been on before, but he's going to be part of a webinar with Greg Rogers. This will be at 6:30 in the evening on May 5th. And the two of them did an article that really exposed the degree to which New Mexico was vulnerable to the gas and oil crash. And Gary Rogers has written sort of the seminal book on how to understand gas and oil industry the way they keep their records and the way they present their fiscal position. And his view on that is that essentially what they do is they don't tell you what the costs are going to be when it's time to close up shop, and then they just move out of town and leave you with the bill. And so that's going to be a very interesting conversation. And again, that's May 5th, 6:30 to 8. And on the 26th of May, we're going to have a conversation with 3 people from the New Mexico Voices for Children. And that'll be with Bill Jordan, who's their lead lobbyist. It'll be with Paige Knight, one of their lead researchers, and with the co-director or the deputy director, Amber Wallen. And we're going to have a legislator joining us for that conversation. Right now, the New Mexico State Legislature is facing a $2 billion deficit because of the crash in the gas and oil industry. And as a result of that, there's going to be a special session in June. And these folks are going to be the people who are going to be at the center of those discussions, as they're sort of the conscience of the state. And then on June 9th, we're going to have a conversation about public banking in New Mexico. And I'll give you more details on that as we get closer to the date. Again, June 9th. And all of these Zoominars, you need to pre-register for to ensure you get a seat in the Zoom room. And to do that, you go to retakeourdemocracy.org. It's the same old thing. Hover over events and actions page and find Zoominar series there, and they'll have links and everything and direct you to how to get there. The last Zoominar was oversubscribed, and so people were left out, and so you'll want to register as soon as possible. So that's all the announcements for today. So now let's get to our guest, Cylvia Hayes. Welcome, Cylvia.
Thanks. Hi, good to be here.
Okay. Well, I'd like to let our guests introduce themselves. I've read a couple of your articles in preparation for this interview, but could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you found yourself writing about sustainable economic development?
Yeah, I've been in that field for about 25 years now. I started out my work in sustainability definitely as more of an activist working on issues related to biodiversity preservation, particularly kind of an early front runner in more conservative communities in the West, waving the flag about climate change, and then realized that in my opinion, the underlying cause of so many of our environmental and honestly many of our social issues is a fundamentally unsustainable economic model, which we'll talk about in the course of this interview. Pardon?
I said no argument here.
Yeah, so I've been writing and working on that for a long time. I founded my company, 3E Strategies, as a not-for-profit. It transitioned into a consulting firm, I think about a dozen years ago, but still always working on those issues. I'm currently developing a course for Oregon State University that I'll start teaching in the fall. I'm super excited about it, called Humans, Environment, Alternative Economic Possibilities. And it's going to be offered over their eCampus, so it's got a potential for a really wide reach. And then along the way with all of this, I'm also the former First Lady of Oregon and was very involved in Governor Kitzhaber's administration, and I specifically was working on things like development of a genuine progress indicator for the state and actually for a number of states, and development of ways of actually integrating poverty reduction throughout the entire state budget, not just making it about getting resources to people once they are in the crisis of poverty. So I've been on that track for a long time, and I do not say this with lack of compassion, but in some ways, I feel as though I've been waiting for something like COVID-19 to hit for a long time, because it has the potential to give us an opportunity for a reset.
Right. Well, that's certainly something that we've been reading about, that the silver lining is the opportunity to pause a bit and rethink what we're doing. And that was the core to your article, you know, that drew me to asking you to be on the show.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that in just a minute. But you point to the gross concentration of wealth and income in America as being one of the aspects of normalcy. I mean, part of what your argument is that the normal that we are sort of yearning to get back to was killing us. And that was the title of your article. Great article, listeners. You want to check it out. And that level of income inequality should be unacceptable to us. To what degree has wealth concentration in America prevalent, and what do you see as the causes of that wealth discrepancy?
Yeah, I think it's systemic now. I mean, I think we have an economy of for and by the 1% for the most part. And I don't think it's all necessarily been sinister and evilly done, although make your judgment on some of the pieces. But one of the things that I'm always trying to point out to folks is, and if you do polling across our country, you'll find that the prominent metaphors that people use when thinking or talking about the economy are it's an act of God or a force of nature or, you know, a massive machine. The reality is the economy is a human-made construct. We created it and we recreate it and tweak it and shape it all the time. And so from everything from our tax policy, the fact that wealth is its own wealth-generating entity in our society now, the culture of cheap consumer items that require people to work minimum wage, the culture of a throwaway society, and the subsidies that keep all of these things going are what have led to an extraordinary income inequality. We have the highest income inequality of any G7 nation at this point. And it is structural and it is systemic. It's institutionalized in that, you know, we were partially put on this path all the way back to once we started abolishing slavery, right? So we're now in a situation where we tell ourselves this story that we are the land of upward mobility, but numerous studies have shown the single biggest contributing factor to whether or not you can jump to the next highest class level is your zip code.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's get back to the title of your essay that was published in Resilience this last week. You say that the normal that we are have been living in for decades and centuries, even, is killing us. How is it killing us?
Yeah. So what I really wanted to do with that piece is I wanted to get people to start examining what we were allowing to be normal. When, you know, the clamor right now is let's get back to normal, and my heart does go out. I mean, this is a really, really disruptive and stressful time for so many people, whether or not they're physically or their loved ones are physically in harm, or whether they're, you know, one of the masses of people who are living paycheck to paycheck and now those paychecks are gone. So it's a real deal. Normal might be just, please let me get enough income coming back in to feed my family this week. So I don't want to make light of that, but I do want us to look at the cultural norm that we had been existing. The COVID-19 is not what wrecked the economy. The economy was unstable and not working for most of us before COVID-19. Right. So we have an unprecedented level now of what they call deaths of despair in the United States, which includes drug-related deaths, alcohol-related deaths, suicide. This has gone up lockstep with the proliferation of this particular form of capitalism. That's one aspect. And even if it's not taking you to that level, we have so many people living with chronic levels of stress and uncertainty, and we consider it normal. We consider it normal that a tiny, tiny fraction of people in our country hold more wealth than all the rest of us by far. Mm-hmm. We consider it normal that you sometimes put off going to see a doctor for a potentially serious issue because you're not sure what it's going to cost. We consider it normal that a health issue is the second leading reason for bankruptcy. And so there's the whole human and quality of life cost. And then there's also the fact that we are based on a limitless growth economic model that has normalized destruction of our natural resources and our planetary life support systems in order to prop up continuous growth in GDP. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Considered that normal.
Yeah, and one of the things that scares me, I don't know how familiar you are with the work of Naomi Klein, mm-hmm. book Shock Doctrine. She talks about how the corporate sector preys on moments like COVID.
That's right.
We're all in shock, and workers want to go back to work desperately. And so corporations know that vulnerability, and they can say, well, yeah, we want to open up, but the benefit package we've been offering you, or the guaranteed 30 hours or 40 hours a week, well, we can't really do that anymore. And so the workers who are desperate come back and accept that, and then we gravitate to yet another new normal that's even worse than the previous. And so that's why I was drawn to your work, where you talk about having to use this pause to really rethink normal. So I want to remind our listeners that this is Retake Our Democracy, and I'm the host of Retake Our Democracy, Paul Gibson. I'm speaking with Cylvia Hayes, and Cylvia, in your article, Normal Was Killing Us, you point out that largely invisible biases help the wealthy obtain and maintain their wealth. And that was something that you sort of alluded to in your last response, but can you expand on how it is that it's almost genetically coded? You had mentioned by zip code, but how is it that what are these biases that proliferate in our culture that enable the wealthy to just continue to have their hold on their wealth while the rest of us kind of just scramble?
Yeah, I think you just touched on it in part. Your show is called Retake Our Democracy, but I don't believe we're actually functioning in a democracy. I believe we are more of a corporatocracy. Mm-hmm. And so again, part of the normal was that we had a system, a structure in place where corporations with, quote, very limited liability were allowed to prey upon people of modest means. We're allowed to prey upon situations like this. We're allowed to prey upon our environment, even our public lands environments. So those are the fundamental pieces that are systemically embedded in what has been normal, and those are the biases. So it's things like the loopholes that allow those corporations to pay very little tax. We have a Robin Hood society right now where we have wealth trickling up from the poorer to the wealthy few. And the biases are now embedded in systems. And it's very difficult because the people who are benefiting from them in this particular system where a dollar is viewed as a vote, those people have the power to keep those systems in place. And then I do also, so there are economic, there are tax structure, there are corporate liability structures in place. I think that there are also some really powerful cultural biases that we all are culpable for, and we all need to take a look at. And at risk of pissing people off, I'll put a few of them out there. And I'm not saying that I am not also caught in this, because I'm not putting myself out there like I am completely perfect and better and above. I want that to be clear. Because we're all caught in the very same system that we may be trying to change. But some of our cultural biases in the US happen to be the notion of US exceptionalism. We're this and we're that. Well, not so much when you really look at it. We need to have a little bit of humility there at this point.
Humility is not our strong suit.
It hasn't been, which is maybe why we're a ground zero for this current crisis, right? We're really paying a high price for arrogance right now. Mm-hmm. Some of the other cultural biases, it is the consumer culture. It's the comparing ourselves to and judging our worth based on how much stuff I have, and the latest, newest gadget or what have you. And we exist within a marketing culture that just drives us toward that. And I just feel very strongly that questioning that is also, I think, one of the silver linings that's coming up in this particular situation. And then there is clear, hands down, we still have a racist, sexist society, period. We've made progress, we're making progress, but we have biases built in that make it harder for people of certain ethnicities and people of certain gender to jump classes, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I need to remind our listeners that they're listening to KSFR 101.1 FM. It's your public radio station in Santa Fe. And it's an almost all volunteer operation. Almost all of the people like me who do these shows are volunteers. But they do have costs, and that's for engineers and equipment, and so they need donations. And so if you go to ksfr.org, you can click on the donate button on the top of the website, and I'd strongly encourage you to make a contribution, $10, $20, and just kind of view it as your ticket for admission to this show and the other shows that you enjoy. It's a particularly important community resource at this time when we're all shut in and isolated. So toss them a little change if you can do it. We'll get back to our interview now with Cylvia Hayes. You point out how 50% of Americans are essentially living paycheck to paycheck, and hence are extraordinarily vulnerable when something like COVID comes in, or when they get a flat tire, or when they get their engine blows, or any of those kinds of personal tragedies, or not even tragedies. There should be routine inconveniences, not bankrupting occasions. And but what I found particularly interesting was in your article, and again it was that normal was killing us, was that you pointed out how vulnerable the economic system itself is, not just the 50% of us who are living paycheck to paycheck, but that essentially it's predicated almost like a house of cards in debt and so forth. Would you extrapolate on that?
Yeah, and again, COVID-19 is pointing it out, but so many other things could have done this. I mean, I work with a team of international folks who we've been running scenarios that were really calling for it. They were actually envisioning a crash of the financial systems in the next several years, like near term future, that would bring the kind of contraction of GDP that we're seeing right now. And a lot of work was being done there. And the reason that seemed so likely was because the debt levels that we have in place already, a vast proportion of this growth in GDP, not just in the US, but many of the big economies over the past few decades, has been very much debt-based. We really were at a point where no country could call another country for it, and it leaves us at potential escalating inflation, everything else when the crisis does come. And we're seeing that. And we're going to be seeing that piece coming to bear on the other side of this as well. So that was very flimsy and precarious. Meanwhile, another super interesting aspect we're seeing play out here are supply chains. So we've shifted, basically what we've done to achieve the kind of economic growth and the kind of mega profits for big business that we've seen in the last 20, 30 years. We have traded out economic resilience for economic efficiency for those targeted big industries. And so, for instance, pharmaceuticals, right? My God, before this blew up, nobody really realized that we don't even manufacture any of our own antibiotics here in the States anymore, or even vitamin C. And we don't, because big pharma has offshored that because they can't make the profit margins on it that they can make on other designer drugs. And not just designer drugs, but critically important drugs that they then ratchet the prices up through the roof. So I believe certainly one of the required, and hopefully we'll take steps toward it in how we rebuild coming out of this, is the relocalization of certain supply chains, not only at a national scale, but even in community scale. Mm-hmm. So that was very precarious. And then, yes, when you have an economy that does not have universal health care, but and has the most expensive health care in the world, because let me correct myself, we do have universal health care. It's called the emergency room, because emergency rooms are legally required to take a person in, and that's the most expensive care you can get. But we have no sane system of healthcare. I will rephrase myself. Combined with the fact that we do have so many of us with almost no savings and living paycheck to paycheck in an economy that is not suited to the actual living wage requirements that are the reality. You put all those things together and we've got what we've got right now.
Yeah. Well, and, since the deregulation really of the pharma industry, all of a sudden now, while they don't have the money to invest in research on critically needed medications and so forth, all you have to do is watch the news at 6 o'clock any evening, and every commercial is pitching some what looked like spurious, like need-based, we didn't even know we had this condition or problem or that it existed, but now there's a medication for it, and they're selling it on TV nonstop. So we are really close to out of time for the show itself. We're going to switch over to the podcast in a second, but I did want to give Cylvia an opportunity to tell you where she can be reached, where you can find more of her writing and so forth. So Cylvia, why don't you fill us in on that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So the website, my company, 3E Strategies, it's the number 3 letter E strategies.org. That's where I do this new economy work. That's where I first posted this post on the normal is killing us. I also work with people on resiliency and empowerment support. I have a book called When Life Blows Up, A Guide to Peace, Power, and Reinvention. It tells of my experience having been put through a pretty massive public shaming within a political arena and the resiliency muscles that developed as a result. So I actually have really dropped the price even on my book. I never could have dreamed that it would publish a couple of weeks before everybody's life blew up. So I'm hoping that it's helpful to folks, and I wanted to mention that. And then the final piece, Paul, that I want to mention is, I hope we have time, but it's your point about supporting public broadcasting and local news outlets. And going through and experiencing what I did within high-level political situation and really seeing firsthand how, I will curb my language, how messed up our current for-profit corporate media system is. It is 100% a part of our current problem with a broken democracy the current problem with unlimited money in democracy. And it is all about clickbait, sensationalism, and driving ratings. And we have never needed public broadcasting more.
Well, we'll have to close with that, and we'll be back in a minute, and we'll talk a little bit more about what you were talking about in terms of your political, the issues in Oregon that you were faced with. That's it for today. Retake Our Democracy. We'll be back next week. And by the miracle of podcast, we're back, and we can be a little more casual during the podcast. In fact, in one podcast that I did, I slipped an F-bomb, and I called the station after I had sent over the recording, and they said, "Was it during the show or during the podcast?" And I said, "Well, it was during the podcast." And he goes, anyway, it was the podcast. You know, it wasn't intentional. It just sort of, sort of WTF is going on, and it just came out. So anyway, we're back, and we're with Cylvia Hayes. And you alluded to this. I wasn't going to bring it up. I had read about, didn't read much about it, but I had read about there being what you characterized as a public shaming. And so if you're comfortable with it, if you wanted to tell the audience a little bit about it, I mean, that's not really the import of the show, but you brought it up. So what was that about?
Yeah, I think the main reason I brought it up in the show was just I've had an inside seat on how destructive our current corporate for-profit media structure is at this point, how much a part of it, of the problem it is. What happened with me, I'm a pretty open book, and again, I talk a lot more about this in my book, When Life Blows Up, A Guide to Peace, Power, and Reinvention, but was while serving as the First Lady of Oregon and while the governor was running for re-election, a reporter who had been after me for a long time, years, unsuccessfully, uncovered some things that I had done. One was a green card marriage, and being peripherally involved in a planned but never followed through on marijuana farm that I had done many years earlier, and used those mistakes from my past to, not just this person, there was a whole cabal. It was a pretty well orchestrated political takedown, because the misdeeds from my past were really used to throw fire on a campaign of false allegation that the governor and I had misused our public positions for personal gain. And we were investigated by IRS, FBI, DOJ for 2.5 years until they came back and said there's nothing here to file charges for. But by that time, there was my life before October 7th, 2014, and my life after, period. Mm-hmm. And so really, I was shocked at the level of misinformation and spin that corporate media can put forward. And there's almost no way to counter it, especially if you're quote a public figure, which is very loosely defined. I was not an employee. I was a volunteer First Lady for the state. But anyway, so it really changed my whole perspective and trust level regarding for-profit media, which is not a bad thing. I think I was just waking up from a little bit of a lull that I had been in, believing otherwise.
Yeah, well, I've had relatively limited exposure, well, more so now with Retake Our Democracy. But when I was a consultant in the Bay Area, every once in a while I'd be interviewed for things on the radio or for a newspaper article, and was continually astonished at how something that I did say could be taken out of context and mean almost the exact opposite of what, if you heard the whole thing, was meant and intended. And so I've gotten very, very cautious about what I say in some instances. Not so cautious on the radio show or in the blog, which is.
Yeah, but then you've got it on record of what you actually say in context.
Oh, that's true.
I got to where I wouldn't respond to any of it without having either a full written statement or a full interview, and even more careful to have a full written statement with an interview so that it couldn't be cut and spliced.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's shift back to what we were talking about before. One of the things, and you've spoken a bit about the pharmaceutical industry, and but now we're going to talk about the mortgage industry or the speculative industry from Wall Street. And you wrote about how in 2007 and 2008, the mortgage collapse could have been an opportunity to kind of rethink what we do and how we do it and how we prioritize. And that recovery could have been a pivot for our country. And it really wasn't. And if you go back to what we were talking about before about Naomi Klein and shock doctrine, well, Wall Street used that to further, to continue to deregulate their industry, consolidate their controls, and go about business as usual. So what about that? And what could we have done differently that would have facilitated a real genuine pivot?
Well, I don't want to put forward that I have the expertise to go back and redesign that. What I was hoping to get to in my article is that people would that we would recognize that we had missed an opportunity there, that we had basically bailed out big business in a way that empowered big business to continue to dominate, monopolize, and continue to have deleterious effects on society. We're going to need to be really, really careful in the multiple stimulus packages that are going to be coming to try to help us, and in this case, all these other countries, come back out of this. So I wrote a previous piece on what I wanted to see in the first stimulus package, which definitely excluded the cruise ship industry, who don't even pay taxes here. That one made it through. I was happy about that. But what I would be doing right now, and again, I wrote about this, right now, while so many factories are idling, this would be the time to actually have a stimulus package that was getting people in there and giving them work, retrofitting, regrading, upgrading, cleaning up those factories, create a whole workforce there. We need to get really serious. And I think it's going to have to be not just a complete don't bail out coal, don't bail out oil. I think for the most part you don't. But it needs to be done in a way that the average workers in those legacy industries are supported in transitioning into industries that society actually needs now. This is the kind of redesign we could be doing. We are going to spend on our grandkids' credit cards trillions of dollars to get through this. We ought to be investing it in the jobs and industries that are needed now, and not in those who are entrenched and who've helped to drive us into the ditch that we're in right now. So for instance, this would be a time to actually say, okay, big oil's hit its bubble. Big oil set itself up for this. Let's be clear, the overproduction, the over pumping and not even having enough storage capacity, that was in place before COVID hit. But they were not planning for this kind of a scenario. So I believe the workers in those industries need help and support. I do not believe the CEOs do.
Right.
Moreover, I don't believe we need to be putting dollars out there that will enable them just to ramp production back up again, because we have a glut in the market outside of COVID-19. So those are some of the sorts of things. There's a very interesting movement now calling for nationalization of pharma. I think that's worth a look. I think they've behaved in a way that leaves them very, very vulnerable to a serious consideration about whether or not society would be better served by nationalization there.
Yeah, and
So
I've seen nationalization as a suggestion for the airline industry, for pharma, for banking, and for energy. And, in all instances, we've seen that the corporate ethos, and in truth, their mandate is to maximize profit. But that has zero to do with what you and I experience and need from those industries. And nationalization of those industries could go a long ways toward, or at least where we have a seat at the board, on the board and the table, the public. Because our priorities and needs are certainly not on the table very often.
no, and I think part of this again is getting down to assumptions. What do we mean by profit, right? So one of the areas that I've worked a lot in is shifting past gross domestic product as a metric of success for our nation. We're going to be just flooded with talk about get the GDP going, get the GDP going. The guy who created the GDP, Simon Kuznets, warned, don't use this as a metric to measure the success of your society. It's one piece. So, we need to be asking growth of what and for what. When we say we got to get the economy growing again, what are we growing and why? Profits, is it just straight up financial profits, or would we actually like to have some profits come in the form of the general populace having less stress in the rat race coming out of that? There's the whole concept of capital, but there's also natural capital, the health, wealth, well-being of our people, or that's human capital, and natural capital, which is the underlying value of our natural resources, our farmlands, our environment, those sorts of things. There's a lot of work that has been and is going on that. There's a movement now that I'm also working in called a meaningful economy. How do we shift from a limitless growth to a meaningful economy where people actually are able to more enjoy what they do and how we make a living? An important question is, hey, is this economy working for you, or are you just working for it?
Right.
And a lot of people are just working for it.
Interesting too, because one of the things Alex Yang was promoting in the debates was this minimum annual income. And
Andrew Yang, yes.
that by doing that, people, first of all, it would reward many of the people in society or caretakers and so forth who get nothing for that but our society. And boy, are we aware of it now that the child care centers are closed and the schools are closed. All of a sudden, we recognize how we are dependent in these ways. And wouldn't it be nice if we had a caring economy that offered us the opportunity and enough income so that we didn't have to work that second job? It's as if that has never occurred to us.
I wrote about that too in this previous post, and it's called guaranteed basic income or universal basic income. And I was just interviewed with another show program that's working on this now. But there have been a number of pilot projects in Europe and even a number of states, and there actually are some counties right now in the U.S. that are working on this. And, it gets a bit of pushback because let's say you just give every person $2,000 or $2,500 a month or whatever the baseline is. Will everybody just get lazy and do nothing then? But most of the studies have shown that's not the case at all. People get a baseline kind of met, and then they go on and do other things, and they're freed up to do other things. And I believe I heard that Nancy Pelosi actually recently floated this idea, which I think is exciting. This is a time we're going to need to be rolling out so many stimulus support programs. Why not take this as a time to just let everybody know this is what we're going to be doing for the next year? And then maybe we switch back. You know, one of the big initiatives that I hatched and led while I was serving as First Lady of Oregon was the Prosperity Initiative. And that was the piece I mentioned in the show where we were taking a really systemic approach to poverty prevention. And we never moved this forward before we were no longer in position, but we did some baseline studies of what would universal basic income look like in Oregon. And when we ran it at a couple $1,000s per citizen, it stacked up pretty favorably compared to all the public assistance programs we already had in place to capture people once they had fallen into the absolute crisis of poverty. So we're broken right now. We might as well try some new ways of going about things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I just need to give an apology to Andrew Yang. I call him Alex Wang. Alex Wang was an associate of mine at Gibson and Associates 30 years ago, and a great associate, I might add, but I flip-flopped. Let's take a moment to talk. One of the ways you closed your article was in a series of questions. And part of what you were saying was that as part of this pause, and before we transition back to whatever new normal we're going to either invent or have thrust on us, you had some questions. What were some of those questions? And of those questions, maybe which was the one that maybe was the most important to you?
Well, some of the questions included, as we're thinking about this, what kind of jobs do we need done in society? What kind of work do I personally want to be doing? Do I really need to drive to and back from work every day? Do I maybe like working from home? We certainly can see that we have the capacity. How many hours do I really want to be working every week? Certain other questions like, does it really benefit our society to create a bunch of minimum wage jobs for people who still on that level of pay can't support their families and are going to wind up back on public assistance anyway, working full time and on public assistance? That was normal before all of this happened. I think that this is just a really important time to think about, it'll be thinking about like, how much do I want to travel and how do I want to travel? And I like traveling. I've been blessed. I've burned a lot of fossil fuel running around trying to save the planet, right? I see the paradox there. There is literally our world pre-COVID and our world after. And I love what you just said. The new reality that we either create or have thrust upon us. Mm-hmm. We have to be creative.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, that's a good segue into one of the last questions of the show. And I ask every guest this. One of the abiding assumptions of Retake Our Democracy is that the system that has gotten us into this, and by this I mean the economic and political systems that in the situation we're in right now, simply are not equipped to get us out of it. And so what do you see as a way to help us get out of what kind of system do we need to get out of this situation?
Yeah, I've said for a long time, could have been partly what got me in trouble. In addition to the things I've been talking about here and the need to shift an economic system away from limitless growth that defies the laws of physics, people. Away from limitless growth, we need different metrics beyond GDP that simply tells us how much money is flowing through the system, not whether or not it's making our society better. So to stick on this point just for a second, and then I'll answer the rest of the question. The GDP, for instance, tracks the money spent to keep a kid in juvenile jail as exactly as positive as the same amount of money spent to give that kid an education. It's not a holistic metric. So we need to shift some of that. On the political realm, I have said for a long time, I do not believe we are going to be able to effectively govern ourselves until we evolve past a two-party system and until we wrestle unlimited money out of politics. And I would now say until we disconnect money and politics to for-profit media. So that little triad right there of an entrenched two-party system, unlimited money in electoral politics, and a media that exists and feeds off that has fundamentally broken democracy.
Okay. Well, the last question, and let's try and keep this brief because that little sound you heard was the sound of my computer telling me my battery was about to go out, and I had to plug in the computer, and the computer plug is in the other room. So the last.
So what's very funny is mine just did the same thing. So let's go. Let's break it down.
Are you optimistic post-COVID?
I am optimistic. I think it's going to be a bumpy ride in many ways, but we needed a reset. We needed a time out, and we were going to have a crash one way or another the way we were going, and this gives us a chance to reinvent and recreate and to take care of one another doing it.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation, Cylvia. I hope we can do this again sometime, maybe post-COVID. And to our listeners, I want you to know that I am working on how to manage these radio shows where I'm on camera. And I know that I have a camera lens at the top of my laptop, but if I'm looking at that, I can't see. If I'm looking at my guest, it looks like I'm looking off into the distance.
Yeah, it's hard.
And I'm trying to manage that. So maybe by next show I'll have figured it out, but that's what we've got for today. Again, thank you very much, Cylvia. And maybe you can tell our listeners one more time where they can find out more about you.
Sure, 3estrategies.org and Cylvia with a C, Hayes.com. Those are my two websites.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Cylvia. And safe, happy, healthy, and home.
Yeah, be well and home. Yes, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.